Chapter 1. The ash and the asphalt blood, hot, thick, and completely ruined by silver. That was all Commander Jericho Vance could taste as the forest burned behind him. Smoke choked the night sky, turning the moon into a bleeding eye. The final battle of the Alpha War was over, but the air still tasted like copper and ash. We won, but at what cost? Low, rumbling tone. Retreat, Jericho choked out, his voice ripping through the pack link like broken glass. Break lines, head for the Western Valley, now. His sub-commanders hesitated in his mind, their mental bonds pulsing with terror. They didn't want to leave him. They couldn't bear to leave their leader. After all, he was the Iron Alpha. He was the shield that had kept them alive through 3 years of brutal, savage warfare. But then, the silver-laced wolfsbane in his veins burned hotter, like liquid fire melting his bones. Jericho gripped a charred pine tree, his claws tearing deep into the dead wood. His massive body shook violently because the poison was aggressively eating him alive from the inside out. Next, he felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of tracking hounds in the distance. The Obsidian Cabal was coming to collect their trophy. If they found his body, they would harvest his ancient lineage and enslave his remaining people. That's why he had to run in the opposite direction. He had to lead the danger away from his battered family. Without another word, Jericho broke away from his guards and charged toward the human city border. His vision blurred into a vignette of bloody shadows, yet his legs kept moving on pure, primal instinct. Every single step felt like stepping on broken glass. Let them hunt me. Let them find a corpse. He just needed a quiet, dark alley to lay down and bleed out in peace. He wanted to make sure his enemies couldn't desecrate his remains or gloat over his defeat. Can a man who became a monster to save his people ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Deep down, he knew the truth. Monsters don't get a happy ending. They just get a grave. Soon after, his paws crossed from the soft forest dirt onto the hard, unforgiving city asphalt. The bright neon lights of the human district flashed against his failing eyes, making his head spin out of control. The city smelled terrible. It was an overwhelming mix of gasoline, garbage, and wet cement. Yet right through the middle of that urban stench, his dying wolf instincts picked up something completely impossible. It was a scent so pure, so anomalously peaceful, that it sliced straight through his delirium. Roasted coffee beans, freshly baked vanilla pastries, and crisp, soothing lavender. Before she could move, his body moved on instinct toward that smell. The agonizing burn in his chest flared up again, making him stumble against a brick wall. His heart skipped a beat as his strength completely bottomed out. He was completely out of time and he was collapsing fast. Moments later, his heavy shoulder hit a glass door, and a bright brass bell rang loudly in the quiet night. Chapter 2. The ordinary distance rain lashed against the neon-lit streets, but inside the cafe it was totally dry. Jericho dragged his heavy, human-shaped body through the doorway, his boots leaving thick, black trails of mud and blood on the sparkling clean floor. He was completely unmoored by what he saw. Normal humans were sitting at small wooden tables, completely oblivious to the horrific war that had just occurred a few miles away. They were just talking, laughing, drinking from little ceramic mugs. In fact, the stark psychological distance between his violent reality and this ordinary world made him feel incredibly detached. These people were so frail. They were so beautifully innocent. Looking at them reminded him of everything he had systematically sacrificed inside himself just to survive. I don't belong here. His wolf snarled weakly inside his mind. We are a weapon. We stain everything we touch. What followed was a wave of intense dizziness that dropped him to his knees. He gripped the edge of a pastry display case, his vision swimming with dark spots. His primary goal was incredibly simple now. Drag his useless body into a dark corner so he could die without causing a massive panic. He didn't want these innocent humans to look at him with horror. Because of that, he tried to crawl toward the back of the shop, but his muscles refused to cooperate. The rare silver poison was effectively paralyzing his central nervous system. He could feel his lungs tightening, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Why do humans get to live in the light while his people are forced to tear each other apart in the dark? Is it because humans are too fragile to handle the truth of the world? Truth to be told, he envied them. He envied their simple, mundane problems. They didn't have to worry about rival alphas tearing their throats out or silver weapons melting their skin. Still, his hyper-vigilant eyes kept scanning the room, running tactical threat assessments out of pure habit. He checked the exits. He counted the civilians. He looked for weapons. His mind was trapped in a behavioral loop of warfare, even as his heart started to fail. Suddenly, a woman's shadow fell across his face. She was wearing a faded denim apron and a pair of scuffed combat boots, and she smelled exactly like the dried lavender that had pulled him off the streets. She didn't look like an apex predator, yet she was holding a heavy plastic mop like a weapon. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hide the deep lines of exhaustion on her face, but her eyes were completely fierce. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She wasn't looking at him with political calculation. She just looked incredibly annoyed. Before either could speak, Jericho's legs completely gave out beneath him. His massive, muscular frame tilted forward, his head falling heavily onto her petite shoulder. The space between them burned as his skin made contact with her shirt. A strange, electric shock pulsed through his fading alpha bond, making his wolf gasp in surprise. A beat later, darkness closed in around his mind, cutting off his senses one by one. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Stranger. The moment their eyes locked right before he passed out, Jericho saw something shift inside her. He didn't hear her scream. He didn't feel her push him off onto the dirty floor. Instead, Clara Vance caught his entire massive weight on her small shoulder, her boots skidding slightly against the wet tile. "Whoa, hey, wake up, big guy." Her voice echoed in his ears, sounding frantic but remarkably steady. Instead of dumping him on the curb where he belonged, her body moved on instinct to support him. She wrapped one of his heavy, scarred arms around her neck, using her entire body weight to drag him toward the back of the café. Jericho was completely dead to the world, but his subconscious mind was still tracking her movements. What followed was a slow, agonizing trek across the kitchen floor. Clara was cursing under her breath, her sharp tongue firing off insults that made his semi-conscious mind twitch with a bizarre sense of amusement. "What do they feed you people?" she panted, her heart racing fast against his chest. "You feel like you're made of solid iron. Seriously, if you ruin my freshly mopped floors, I am going to charge you double." To make things worse, a thick puddle of dark lichen blood was dripping from his side, staining her clean apron. Any normal human would have run away or called the police immediately, because his blood was steaming slightly from the silver reaction. Yet, Clara didn't panic. She just unlocked the heavy wooden door to her basement storage room and dragged him inside. Maybe it was fate, or maybe she was just too stubborn to let a man die on her property. She rolled him onto a clean canvas cot tucked between rows of flour sacks and canned goods. As the silence stretched in the dark room, she stood over him, catch her breath. Jericho's golden eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second, tracking her micro-expressions in the dim light. He saw her looking at his massive chest scars, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know what scared her more, the massive, life-threatening wounds covering his body, or the fact that he looked like a living, breathing predator. Deep down, she knew the truth. This man was incredibly dangerous. He was a force of nature that didn't belong in her quiet life. Even so, she didn't leave him. She walked over to a small shelf and grabbed a handful of dried herbs and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The question hung heavily in the dark basement air. Jericho wanted to tell her to run away. He wanted to warn her that his presence was a magnet for extreme violence. But before the words left his lips, his mind slipped away entirely. leaving him at the absolute mercy of a woman who refused to be afraid of him. Chapter 4. The basement prison consciousness returned like a heavy, unexpected blow to the skull. Jericho's eyes snapped open, his pupils instantly dilating into sharp vertical slits as his feral instincts surged to the surface. He went to throw himself out of the cot, but a sharp metallic clink stopped him cold. Chained. He looked down, his jaw tightening as he realized a thick iron chain was looped around his ankle, securing him tightly to a heavy structural support pipe. Low, rumbling tone. Grrrl. A low, rumbling sound vibrated deep in his chest, a warning to whatever predator had captured him. But then his tactical gaze swept the room, and the primal anger morphed into utter confusion. He wasn't in a torture chamber or an enemy dungeon. He was in a dimly lit basement storage room smelling intensely of yeast, dark roasted coffee beans, and that undeniable, soothing lavender. Moments later, his eyes locked onto a figure sitting across the room on an overturned milk crate. Clara Vance sat there calmly, checking her inventory clipboard, completely unbothered by his terrifying awakening or his glowing golden lichen eyes. Instead of attacking him, she reached down and tossed a heavy iron key onto the concrete floor, right at his feet. "Unshackle yourself when you're done brooding," Clara said, her voice completely smooth, dry, and lacking even a hint of submission. "But if you break my plumbing, I'm throwing you to whatever is hunting you." Jericho stared at the key, then back up at her, his mind struggling to compute the psychological profile of this human woman. In fact, his rigid behavioral conditioning was completely breaking down because she was treating him like an inconvenient tenant rather than an apex killer. He reached down with his massive scarred hand, unlocked the padlock, and rubbed his thick ankle. What followed was a wave of pure shock as he looked down at his bare chest. The agonizing, bone-melting heat of the silver wolfsbane was gone, replaced by a cool, thick, green herbal paste smeared neatly over his deep wounds. He could smell the sharp tang of wild sage, dandelion root, and something else. A strange, sweet undertone that was actively neutralizing the supernatural poison in his blood. Because of that, he realized this ordinary human had done the impossible. She had successfully cured an incurable lichen war poison using nothing but raw kitchen resourcefulness. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Deep down he knew the truth. This woman had just painted a massive target on her back by saving his life, violating his core belief that everyone in the world only acts out of vicious self-interest. Yet he couldn't stop staring at her small hands as she casually stacked heavy flour sacks. She was completely fragile, a creature of porcelain compared to his iron frame, but her spirit was like flint. Without another word, he stood up, his massive head nearly touching the low basement ceiling, his predatory shadow completely swallowing her whole. Chapter 5. Ledgers and Liabilities. The ticking of a cheap plastic clock above the stove was the only sound echoing through the cafe's kitchen. Come morning, Clara had gone upstairs to open the shop, leaving Jericho to nurse his aching muscles in the shadows of the back room. He was still far too weak to shift into his wolf form or survive a coordinated assault, which meant he was entirely dependent on her shelter. He explored the narrow, immaculate kitchen, his heightened senses mapping out every square inch of her ordinary world. Suddenly his eyes landed on a worn leather-bound ledger left open on the stainless steel prep table. Jericho flipped through the pages, his analytical mind quickly scanning the neat columns of numbers and red ink. More importantly, he realized with a pang of guilt that the daily grind was facing severe, immediate financial ruin. A predatory commercial landlord was aggressively hiking her rent, trying to force her independent business into a foreclosure so corporate developers could bulldoze the block. Despite that, she had wasted her most expensive, rare organic medicinal herbs on a dangerous, blood-soaked stranger who couldn't pay her a single dime. Why? Jericho thought, his chest aching with a strange, unfamiliar tightness. She is drowning, yet she chose to pull a monster out of the river. Meanwhile, His ears twitched as he tracked the soft, rhythmic sound of her footsteps moving across the dining floor upstairs. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool industrial refrigerator, letting his senses absorb the mundane details of her day. He could hear the hiss of the espresso machine, the clinking of ceramic mugs, and the blunt, no-nonsense way she spoke to her regular customers. She didn't know what scared her more: the predatory wolves hunting her in the dark, or the terrifying debt threatening to swallow her dream in the light. Truth to be told, Jericho recognized the exact same hyper-independence in her that defined his own broken soul. She refused to ask for help, shielding her vulnerability behind a wall of sharp wit and stubborn resilience, just like he hid behind his swords. But then, the peaceful domestic rhythm of the morning was instantly shattered. A sudden, heavy scratching sound vibrated against the heavy metal delivery doors at the back of the kitchen alleyway. Jericho stiffened, his entire body locking into a rigid tactical stance as his nostrils flared, catching a foul, sickeningly familiar odor cutting through the coffee air. Wet fur, sour blood, the unmistakable scent of an obsidian cabal scout. Chapter 6. The Walk-in Fortress. Between one breath and the next, the kitchen door swung open, and Clara walked in with an empty bus tub. She took one look at Jericho's deathly pale face and the feral, lethal tension in his massive shoulders, and she instantly knew something was wrong. Before she could move, Jericho lunged forward, a blur of raw muscle and desperation, and gripped her by the waist, lifting her entirely off her feet. "Hey, put me down!" She started to yell, her voice muffled against his broad chest. Low, rumbling tone. "Quiet," he whispered, his voice a dark, gravelly command that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "They are outside." Without thinking, his body moved on instinct to protect her. He knew he was still too weak to win a direct physical confrontation with a fully healed cabal warrior, and his wolf form was completely locked away by the lingering poison. If he ran out into the alley to fight, he would die, and Clara would be executed as an accomplice. Instead of fighting, he dragged her toward the only reinforced structure in the room, the massive, thick-walled stainless steel walk-in freezer. He shoved her inside the freezing room, stepped in after her, and slammed the heavy insulated door shut, locking them both inside the icy darkness. As the silence stretched between them in the cramped, freezing space, the thick smell of frozen meat and cold steel enveloped them. They were pressed chest to chest, his massive hands braced against the wall on either side of her head, trapping her completely within his heat. While her pulse raced, Jericho tilted his head, his hypersensitive ears pressed against the freezer's metal door, tracking the scout's movements in the kitchen. Scratch. Creak. The heavy lock on the back delivery door groaned outside as the scout began to picket. Clara was trembling violently from the sudden drop in temperature, her breath forming small white clouds in the dim, frosty air. Yet, even as her body shook, she didn't panic. She slowly reached back, her fingers wrapping tightly around the handle of a heavy iron frying pan hanging from a wire rack inside the freezer. She held it with absolute, unyielding defiance, ready to strike whatever came through that door. Jericho looked down at her in the dark, his golden eyes glowing softly, completely unmoored by her actions. A fragile human was standing inside a freezer, holding a kitchen utensil, fully prepared to act as a shield for the most feared war criminal in the supernatural world. In that moment, something inside his chest shifted completely, the ancient frost around his heart melting away in an instant. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The answer didn't matter anymore because his soul had made its choice. He would tear the universe apart before he let anyone touch a single hair on her head. Outside, the heavy scratching sound stopped, the scout's footsteps slowly receding down the alley as the scent of wet fur faded into the rain. The tension broke, leaving them alone in the freezing dark, their breath mingling together as the space between them burned with a sudden intoxicating heat. Chapter 7. The Coffee Grinder. The morning sun filtered through the shattered piece of the kitchen, but the air remained thick. Jericho stood rigidly by the prep table, his massive frame practically vibrating with raw, suppressed adrenaline. The enemy scout was gone for now, but he knew the reprieve was entirely temporary. He needed to be out in the world tracking their movements, yet his internal organs still felt like they were stuffed with wet ash. Before he could speak, Clara marched right up to him and slammed a heavy, faded canvas apron directly into his scarred chest. "Since you're staying and using up my electricity, you're on the clock," Clara said, her voice a sharp, no-nonsense snap that completely ignored his lethal aura. "Grab that handle, start grinding." What followed was a moment of absolute, stunned silence from the former commander. He looked down at the apron, then at the massive manual vintage iron coffee grinder bolted to the wooden counter. It was an antique machine that usually took her human assistant hours of grueling, muscle-straining labor to turn out enough grounds for the morning rush. Instead of arguing, his body moved on instinct to obey her domestic command. He tied the ridiculously small strings of the apron around his massive waist, grabbed the cast iron crank, and began to spin it with effortless, supernatural force. Crunch, whir, crunch. The heavy iron gears groaned under his lichen strength, turning the dark roasted beans into a fine, aromatic powder within seconds. In fact, the repetitive physical exertion of the menial human labor felt strangely therapeutic to his fractured mind. For 3 years, his hands had known nothing but the handles of broadswords and the wet weight of enemy throats. Now, the rich, oily scent of dark espresso beans was deeply filling his lungs, replacing the phantom smell of burning pine trees and black blood. Because of that, he found himself slipping into a bizarre state of psychological peace. The wipe your boots dynamic was fully locking into place, proving that within the walls of her ordinary world, his terrifying reputation held absolutely zero currency. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Still, his hypersensitive ears remained trained on the street outside, tracking the distant hum of human traffic. He knew he didn't belong in this domestic sanctuary, yet the sheer, stubborn normalcy of the woman sweeping the floor beside him made him want to dream of things he had no right to possess. Chapter 8. Watching the Rush. Through the small glass window of the kitchen door, the ordinary world was on full display. Jericho stood hidden in the deep shadows of the doorway, his golden eyes unblinking as he watched Clara handle the chaotic morning rush. The cafe was packed with regular human civilians, students typing furiously on laptops, businessmen checking watches, and mothers pushing strollers. They were completely oblivious to the scarred, immortal titan watching them from behind the threshold. More importantly, Jericho wasn't watching the crowd. His tactical focus was entirely locked onto Clara's every movement and micro-expression. He analyzed her like a seasoned war strategist, tracking the subtle tightness in her jaw whenever a customer complained, and the quick, defensive way she deflected personal questions with a sharp joke. He noticed how she kept everyone at exactly arm's length, relying entirely on her own frantic, exhausting hustle to keep the business afloat. She is exactly like me, Jericho realized, his chest tightening with a profound wave of empathy. She builds walls out of coffee cups, and I build them out of bodies. What followed was a deep behavioral breakthrough as he connected the pieces of her past. He had spotted an old, faded photograph tucked into the corner of the kitchen bulletin board, a young teenage Clara standing outside a foster home with a single cardboard box. She had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect her, forcing her to develop a fierce, hyper-independent armor to survive. Not only that, but her refusal to ask for help was just as dangerous as his own fatalistic isolation. They were both broken souls hoarding their own survival strategies, entirely terrified of showing weakness to a hostile world. While her pulse raced upstairs under the pressure of the morning line, Jericho felt an intense primal drive blooming deep inside his lichen heart. It wasn't the urge to dominate or conquer, but a quiet, overwhelming desire to ease the heavy burden stretching across her small shoulders. But then, his protective reverie was instantly shattered by a sudden spike of toxic pheromones entering the shop. As the silence roared in his ears, his gaze snapped to the front entrance of the cafe, A tall, impeccably dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped through the door, flanked by two massive men whose suits couldn't hide the heavy, unnatural bulk of their shoulders. With his scent in the air, Jericho's wolf instantly woke up, baring its spiritual fangs as it recognized the foul, lingering stench of the Obsidian Cabal front company. Chapter 9. The Shadowed Threat. The air thickened instantly as the three men marched straight to the front counter, bypassing the line entirely. Clara didn't drop her customer service smile, but her posture went completely rigid as the man in the tailored suit tossed a thick legal document onto the polished wood. Jericho leaned closer to the kitchen glass, his senses flaring so violently that the space between his shoulder blades began to burn with a phantom heat. "Miss Vance?" the suit said, his smooth, breezy tone masking a vicious, predatory undercurrent. "This is your final eviction notice. The property has been acquired by the Obsidian Development Group. You have until nightfall to clear out, or we will bulldoze this dump with you inside it." Before she could speak, one of the hidden lichen bodyguards shifted his weight, intentionally letting his jacket part to reveal a silver-plated dagger tucked into his waistband. Low, rumbling tone. "Girl." A lethal, terrifying pressure erupted from Jericho's core in the shadows of the kitchen. He didn't step out into the light, because doing so would expose his survival to the entire Cabal network. Instead, he channeled his raw, dominant alpha aura through the cracks of the kitchen door, directing a concentrated wave of absolute, paralyzing supernatural terror straight at the two bodyguards. In that moment, the two lichen thugs froze mid-breath. Their hidden wolves began to whimper in pure instinctual terror as Jericho's crushing weight slammed into their nervous systems like an invisible anvil. They turned pale, their eyes wide with shock as they realized an apex predator, an entity far more dangerous than their own pack leader, was watching them from the dark. "Sir, we need to go. Now," the first bodyguard choked out, grabbing the executive's arm with a trembling hand, his voice shaking with absolute panic. "What? We haven't even finished." The suit started, but his guards were already dragging him backward toward the exit, their bodies shaking violently from the unseen pressure. They fled the café in a frantic rush, slamming the glass door behind them, leaving the remaining human customers blinking in total confusion at how easily the corporate bullies had backed down. Clara stood behind the counter, completely oblivious to the supernatural war of wills that had just occurred, her breath catching as she stared at the eviction papers. Jericho watched her from the shadows, his hands curling into tight fists as the terrifying truth fully unraveled in his mind. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace, or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The human and supernatural threats had officially merged. The Cabal wasn't just hunting him anymore. They were actively destroying her life to clear the block, and the sanctuary was officially under siege. Chapter 10. The Mug Map. The heavy wooden kitchen table had completely transformed into a makeshift battlefield command center. Jericho leaned his massive hands on the scarred surface, his hyper-focused gaze mapping out the local city grid using whatever objects he could find. He placed a chipped ceramic coffee mug in the center to represent the daily grind, surrounding it with salt shakers and silver spoons to mark the Obsidian Cabal's local safe houses. His tactical mind was firing on all cylinders, calculating escape routes and defensive choke points while the rain continued to beat a frantic rhythm against the glass. "They aren't just buying up properties, Clara," Jericho stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that brooked no argument. "They are establishing a concrete perimeter around your shop. You need to pack a single bag and let me handle them alone." Before the words left his lips, Clara slammed a metal mixing bowl onto the table, completely scattering his carefully arranged salt shakers. "I don't care if you're the king of the monsters, Jericho," she countered, leaning over the table until she was inches from his face, her breath warm against his skin. "In this shop I call the shots. I've spent 5 years bleeding for this place, and I am not running away just because some furry corporate thugs are having a midlife crisis." What followed was a moment of intense, breathless friction as their eyes locked across the ruined map. Jericho felt an overwhelming wave of frustration, because her stubborn pride was completely blinding her to the lethal reality of a lichen blood feud. He wanted to scream at her, to shake her until she understood how easily her fragile human body could be broken by the forces marching toward her door. Yet, beneath his anger, a dark, simmering current of desire pooled low in his belly. Her fierce, unyielding refusal to submit to his alpha authority didn't weaken his position. In fact, it made his wolf claw at his chest, begging to claim her as his permanent mate. Because of that, he realized his traditional military commands were completely useless within this domestic sanctuary. He couldn't order her to safety because she didn't view him as a terrifying sovereign. She just saw a giant, exhausting man who was currently making a mess of her kitchen table. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Deep down, he knew his presence was actively poisoning her world, dragging her kicking and screaming into a supernatural meat grinder. Despite that, when she crossed her arms and glared at him with absolute, fearless defiance, he knew he was completely incapable of leaving her behind. Chapter 11. The Light in the Sage. The air inside the dark dry goods storeroom was suffocatingly thick with the scent of old burlap and dried earth. That night, while Clara was upstairs trying to get some sleep, Jericho sneaked into the back pantry to inventory her remaining organic remedies. His internal organs were still burning with a faint, residual sting, and he needed to mix a stronger counterpoison to fully unlock his dormant lichen strength. He ran his calloused fingers along the dusty glass jars, searching for the soothing chamomile and wild sage she had used to save him. Suddenly, his hand brushed against a heavy, unmarked clay pot hidden deep in the furthest corner of the bottom shelf. A beat later, the space between his fingertips burned as a sharp shock of pure, raw energy pulsed through his skin. Jericho pulled the lid off the jar, his golden eyes widening in absolute stunned disbelief as a faint, iridescent silver luminescence cast a soft glow across his scarred face. "Etheria roots," his inner wolf whispered, its voice trembling with an ancient, instinctual reverence. True, untamed spiritual magic. In fact, this wasn't a standard human herb at all. It was a legendary extinct botanical catalyst that had been completely wiped out during the ancient lichen wars. He picked up a piece of the glowing root, realizing with a shock of absolute clarity that Clara wasn't just an exceptionally lucky, resourceful human barista. She was the completely oblivious direct descendant of the lost line of hedge witches, the legendary healers whose pure spiritual bloodlines could neutralize any supernatural venom. What's worse, he finally understood why the silver-laced wolfsbane in his veins had stopped killing him the moment he collapsed onto her shoulder. Her innate, passive magic had been bleeding into the air, automatically purifying his blood and masking his scent from the cabal's tracking hounds every time she walked past his cot. Without thinking, his body moved on instinct, as the terrifying pieces of the grand puzzle locked into place. She didn't know what scared her more, the financial debt threatening her future, or the reality that her entire existence was a genetic miracle. As the truth unraveled, Jericho felt a wave of cold, paralyzing terror slam into his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Clara wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the most valuable, dangerous target in the entire supernatural underworld. If Alpha Logan discovered her true identity, he wouldn't just execute her. He would cage her, harvest her blood, and use her magic to manufacture incurable weapons of mass destruction. Before he could even process the massive tactical shift, a deafening explosion rocked the front of the building and the air split open with the sound of screaming metal. Chapter 12. The Shattered Haven. The tension broke in a spectacular cascade of flying glass and dark, oppressive magical pressure. Jericho charged out of the storeroom, a blur of fur and fury, as the cafe's beautiful front windows completely shattered inward. 3 massive, half-shifted obsidian cabal executioners tore through the smoke, their jaws dripping with foam, their claws ripping through the cozy leather booths. With simmering rage, "Clara, get back!" Jericho roared, his voice a deafening alpha command that shook the dust from the ceiling. Without another word, he threw his massive frame directly into the path of the lead attacker, using his bare forearms to block a heavy silver blade. Even with his strength only half restored, his tactical combat instincts were flawless. He gripped the wolf's throat, slamming him into the industrial espresso bar, shattering the ceramic cups into a million sharp pieces. Meanwhile, a second executioner bypassed the melee entirely, its red eyes locking onto Clara as she scrambled behind the counter. Jericho tried to disengage, but the two remaining wolves pinned him against the wall, their claws tearing deep lines into his back. He watched in absolute panic as the rogue wolf lunged over the counter, its jaws snapping inches from Clara's throat. No, not her. But then, the ordinary world fought back in a way he never could have predicted. Instead of screaming or freezing in terror, Clara reached back and grabbed the large jar of untamed etheria powder he had left on the counter. With a fierce, desperate cry, she threw the glowing silver dust directly into the face of the leaping predator, her latent magic flaring to life as her anger ignited the powder into a blinding flash of white-hot spiritual fire. The wolf shrieked in agony, its flesh smoking as the pure magic burned away its corrupt, dark energy, forcing it to crash heavily into the street outside. Moments later, Jericho snapped the neck of the final attacker, his breathing ragged as the remaining infiltrators broke formation and retreated into the dark, rainy night. Silence descended over the ruined shop, save for the crackle of burning sage and the dripping of water from the broken ceiling pipes. Jericho stood amidst the wreckage of the sanctuary, his golden eyes fixed on Clara's small, trembling hands, knowing their peaceful illusion was gone forever. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The game had changed completely. The blood war had breached the threshold, and there was absolutely no turning back. Chapter 13. The Gentle Cleansing. The rain poured through the shattered roof, but the space behind the ruined counter felt like a furnace. Jericho knelt on the debris-strewn tile, his massive, scarred hands holding Clara's small fingers with a meticulous gentleness that completely defied his monstrous size. He dipped a clean white rag into a bowl of warm water, carefully wiping away the dark streaks of ash and the small, shallow cuts covering her knuckles. His heart hammered violently against his ribs because the sight of her blood, even a single drop shed in his name, felt like a knife cutting through his soul. "Your heritage is the reason they are here, Clara," Jericho murmured, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly confession that vibrated in the quiet room. "You are the blood of the Etheria witches. My presence brought this destruction to your door, and I am the weapon that drew their sights." Before she could pull away, his thumb gently traced the soft skin of her wrist, feeling her frantic pulse. What followed was a moment of raw, unadulterated vulnerability that stripped away his decades of hardened military conditioning. He laid his entire life bare before her, offering her a final, definitive choice to escape the violent undertow of his world. He could call his remaining loyal pack forces to escort her to a hidden, heavily fortified subterranean mountain fortress, or they could stand together right here in the ruins of her dream. Because of that, he held his breath, fully expecting her to look at his blood-stained shirt with horror and demand that he leave her sanctuary forever. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Deep down, he knew he was asking her to trust a killer with her entire future, a reality that terrified him more than any silver blade. Yet Clara didn't pull her hands back. Instead, she gripped his massive thumbs with an intense, ironclad strength that completely shocked his inner wolf. "We aren't running, Jericho," she stated, her fierce eyes locking onto his glowing golden gaze with absolute, unblinking certainty. "We are rebuilding the front counter, and then we are going to systematically kill whoever sent them to my shop." Chapter 14. The Surge of Souls. The air thickened with the scent of burning silver and crushed sage as the midnight sky turned a bruised, unnatural black. That night, Jericho stood directly behind Clara at the main entrance, his massive chest pressed against her back as he guided her hands along the wooden door frames. He was teaching her how to channel the latent raw magic sleeping inside her veins, tracing complex defensive runes into the thresholds using a mixture of melted silver and etheria powder. Every time their fingers brushed against each other, a sharp electric shock traveled up his arms, making his wolf purr with a primal, possessive hunger. Suddenly, as their hands fully synchronized over the final protective ward, a brilliant flash of silver light erupted from the wood. The moment their eyes locked through the spiritual glare, the ancient bond pulsed violently, triggering a profound, uncontrollable surge of mutual empathy between their minds. Jericho gasped out loud, his head snapping back as his darkest, most agonizing war memories came tearing out of his subconscious mind, exposing his crushing survival guilt directly to her thoughts. He forced her to feel the weight of every soldier he had lost, every throat he had torn out, and the total, crushing isolation of his life. Despite that, Clara didn't sever the telepathic connection or recoil from the horrific imagery flooding her brain. Rather, she opened her own mind completely, letting him experience the agonizing pain of her lonely childhood, the cold nights spent in foster care, and the desperate, frantic hustle she used to build her small café. She used her innate soothing magic to wrap around his psychological scars, absorbing his ancient trauma and replacing the cold frost in his heart with an intoxicating, burning heat. She felt it, clear as day, that his broken soul was the exact missing piece her lonely existence had been searching for since the beginning. Without another word, Jericho buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the deep scent of lavender and vanilla as his massive body shook with a profound sense of relief. His deepest internal misbelief, the absolute certainty that he was an irredeemable monster, was being utterly dismantled by her unconditional acceptance of his darkest parts. But then, the beautiful spiritual harmony was instantly shattered by a low, rhythmic vibration that began to shake the very foundations of the city street. Chapter 15. The Armada at the Gate. The tension broke as the bright neon streetlights outside suddenly flickered and died, plunging the entire district into total darkness. Moments later, a massive armada of sleek black SUVs rounded the corner, their heavy tires grinding against the wet asphalt as they completely surrounded the entire block. The doors flew open in perfect military unison, and dozens of fully armored obsidian cabal warriors stepped onto the pavement, their automatic weapons catching the faint moonlight. Before she could move, Jericho pulled Clara behind his massive frame, his eyes turning into predatory slits as a towering figure stepped out of the lead vehicle. Low, rumbling tone. "Jericho!" Alpha Logan's voice boomed through the empty street, amplified by a harsh, grating supernatural charm that made the glass windows rattle. "I know you are hiding in that human garbage dump. Surrender the witch now, and I will let your remaining sub-commanders live." To make things worse, 2 cabal thugs dragged his surviving sub-commanders out into the street, forcing them onto their knees with silver collars chained around their necks. Jericho's entire body went completely rigid, his claws extending past his knuckles as a blinding wave of frantic fury and old tactical guilt threatened to tear his mind apart. His old conditioning screamed at him to act as a disposable shield, to throw his life away to save his men and protect the woman he loved from suffering a horrific fate. He was being pushed to the absolute brink of a psychological collapse, trapped between his duty as a leader and his consuming desire as a mate. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The ultimate test of his transformation was standing directly outside his door, and he could no longer afford to act like a mindless weapon of war. Instead of panicking, he caught Clara's steady, unblinking gaze as she calmly stood beside the industrial espresso machine, manually loading a heavy metal portafilter with sharp silver shavings and explosive etheria powder. Her quiet, terrifying defiance gave him his tactical answer, and with a single glance, the Iron Alpha officially locked into the final bloody conflict. Chapter 16. The Shattered Wards. The black SUVs sat like predatory beetles beneath the bruised sky, their headlights cutting through the heavy rain. Without warning, A high-frequency screech ripped through the air, vibrating so violently that the remaining glass panels in the cafe doors instantly pulverized into dust. Alpha Logan smiled coldly on the asphalt, gesturing to a massive, military-grade sonic cannon mounted to the bed of the lead truck. The localized sound waves slammed into the building like an invisible battering ram, fracturing the brickwork and sending a shower of plaster over the kitchen. Low, rumbling tone. "Arr!" Jericho roared, clutching his head as the supernatural frequency violently assaulted his hypersensitive lichen hearing. But then, an even worse sound followed from the thresholds of the building. The silver and sage runes Clara had meticulously carved into the wooden door frames began to smoke, turning a sickly, corrosive black. The brutal mechanical frequency wasn't just shattering concrete, it was actively disrupting the spiritual vibrations of her defensive magic, causing the etheria wards to short-circuit and snap. Between one breath and the next, the impenetrable sanctuary broke open, leaving them completely exposed to the horde waiting in the street. "They're tearing the house down, Jericho!" Clara shouted over the deafening mechanical roar, her hands shaking as she held the silver-loaded espresso portafilter like a makeshift grenade. What followed was a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation that overrode Jericho's newly found tactical patience. He looked at the cracked ceiling, then at Clara's pale face, and he knew that if the roof collapsed, she would be buried alive before she could ever use her magic. He couldn't stay inside like a trapped rat, because her survival depended on him drawing Logan's primary fire away from the shop. Because of that, his body moved on instinct as he threw open the ruined front door and charged directly out onto the rain-slicked asphalt. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Deep down, he feared his ancient, violent destiny had finally caught up with him, demanding a blood sacrifice he wasn't ready to give. Yet as his boots pounded against the wet road, his wolf form refused to surface because the lingering silver poison from the battlefield was still clogging his veins. He was fighting as a man, an iron-willed, heavily scarred man, facing an entire army of fully shifted monsters. Chapter 17. The Alpha's Downfall. Rain lashed against his bare chest, washing away the green herbal paste that had been keeping his internal organs together. Jericho hit the front line of cabal executioners like a runaway freight train, his fists cracking against their jaws with a desperate, terrifying strength. He didn't use a sword. He used his bare knuckles, his elbows, and his teeth, tearing through Logan's front line out of pure, primal necessity to protect the shop behind him. He was a whirlwind of raw muscle and fury, but his battered body was operating on borrowed time. Suddenly, as he turned to intercept a leaping wolf, a sharp, catastrophic relapse tore straight through his chest cavity. The silver wolfsbane, which had been passively suppressed by Clara's proximity, flared back to life with a vengeance the moment he stepped away from her magical aura. His lungs completely locked up, his muscles turning into useless lead as a violent wave of black blood erupted from his throat, dropping him heavily to his knees in the middle of the street. Before he could move, Alpha Logan stepped through the ranks of his men, a wicked silver-plated broadsword gleaming beneath the moonlight. "You're old, Vance," Logan sneered, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance as he drove the heavy silver blade deep into Jericho's left shoulder, pinning him directly to the asphalt. "The Iron Alpha is nothing but a rusted, broken relic." What's worse, Logan twisted the blade, sending a fresh wave of agonizing, white-hot torment through Jericho's central nervous system. Jericho screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony that echoed through the empty neighborhood as his forehead hit the wet pavement. He tried to grip the blade to pull it out, but the pure silver fried the flesh of his palms, leaving him completely helpless. In that moment, his deepest, most terrifying internal flaw was fully realized. He wasn't an invincible shield. He was just a broken, dying soldier whose weakness was about to get everyone he loved slaughtered. Through the loud ringing in his ears, he heard the heavy thud of combat boots moving past his head, heading straight for the cafe entrance. "Drag the witch out," Logan commanded, his eyes glowing with a sinister, triumphant light. Let the commander watch his sanctuary burn before he dies. Chapter 18. The Bitter Draught. Time stood still as Jericho lay pinioned to the cold, wet asphalt by 3 silver spikes driven through his limbs. He could only watch through a fog of blood and rain as 2 massive cabal thugs dragged Clara out of the shattered entrance of the daily grind. They held her by her arms, her scuffed combat boots scraping uselessly against the pavement as they forced her to her knees right in front of Logan. Her hair was soaked, her denim apron torn, but her fierce eyes were still glaring at the enemy leader with absolute unyielding hatred. So, this is the grand miracle, Logan mused, reaching down to grab her tightly by the throat, lifting her chin until her toes barely touched the ground. She smells like flowers and old dirt. Let's see how much magic is really in her veins. Before either could speak, Logan reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a glowing, concentrated purple liquid, the raw, undiluted silver wolfsbane poison. Low, rumbling tone. "No. Logan, stop," Jericho choked out, his voice cracking as he violently thrashed against the silver spikes pinning him to the road. "Take my lineage. Take my life. Just leave her out of this." Instead of listening, Logan let out a dark, booming laugh, forcing Clara's jaw open with his thick fingers. He tilted the vial back, ruthlessly forcing her to swallow the entire concentrated dose of the supernatural poison to prove her mortality and break her spirit before his eyes. "Drink up, little witch," Logan hissed, tossing the empty glass vial into the gutter where it shattered into tiny pieces. What followed was a moment of absolute, heart-shattering horror that tore Jericho's soul completely in half. Clara gasped, her small frame instantly going rigid as the toxic purple fluid hit her system, her eyes rolling back into her head as a low, suffocating wheeze escaped her lips. Logan casually tossed her aside like a piece of garbage, letting her body crash heavily into the wet gutter, right next to Jericho's bleeding face. She lay there shivering violently, her skin turning a deathly, translucent pale as the silver poison began to aggressively melt her human organs from the inside out. Jericho crawled across the agonizing 3 feet of distance separating them, his flesh tearing against the silver spikes as he desperately pressed his forehead against hers. Their eyes locked one last time through the pouring rain, her breath catching as the very last spark of her beautiful lavender scent began to fade into the cold night air. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The silence roared around them as her eyelids fluttered shut, her heartbeat slowing to a final, tragic stop, leaving the Iron Alpha completely alone in the dark. Chapter 19. The Red Crack. The world didn't end with a whimper. It ended with a profound, terrifying silence. Jericho pressed his forehead against Clara's cold, wet cheek, his nostrils expanding as he desperately sought a single molecule of her sweet, life-giving lavender scent. There was nothing, only the sharp, corrosive stench of the purple-silver poison eating her from the inside out. Her pulse had completely vanished beneath his calloused fingertips, leaving her small body entirely limp on the dark asphalt. Low, rumbling tone. "Clara!" A broken, jagged whisper escaped his lips, sounding less like a dominant alpha and more like a dying child. But then, something deep within his genetic code cracked wide open. Between one heartbeat and the next, the crushing weight of his survival guilt, his ancient trauma, and his absolute adoration for this fragile human woman fused into a singular nuclear point of raw fury. He didn't care about his failing muscles anymore because a world without her light was a world that simply had no right to exist. His human mind stepped aside entirely, relinquishing absolute control to the primordial predator sleeping in his bones. What followed was a sound that made the entire neighborhood freeze in instinctual terror. A growl rose in his throat, a sound so deep, so unnaturally resonant, that it vibrated the water in the puddles and shattered the remaining glass windows of the black SUVs. The 3 silver spikes pinning his limbs to the ground began to screech as his muscles suddenly expanded with a terrifying, impossible surge of adrenaline. Without thinking, His body moved on instinct as he forcefully ripped his arms upward, shearing through his own skin and snapping the solid silver spikes like cheap toothpicks. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The answer didn't matter because he was no longer a man seeking a quiet life. He was an instrument of absolute, unadulterated vengeance. As if pulled by a string, the dormant lichen lineage in his blood completely overpowered the silver wolfsbane poison, burning it out of his system in a spectacular, agonizing flash of golden energy. He stood up from the pavement, his massive frame towering over the executioners, his eyes glowing with a blinding, predatory light that turned the dark rain into a golden fog. Chapter 20. The savage retribution. The tension broke in a cataclysmic explosion of raw, primal violence. Jericho didn't just shift into his wolf form. His body underwent a monstrous, terrifying evolution, his bones snapping and elongating until a 9-foot-tall, silver-furred lichen monstrosity stood beneath the moonlight. Alpha Logan's arrogant smile instantly vanished, his face turning a comical shade of chalky white as he scrambled backward toward his armored truck. Low, rumbling tone. Roar! The sound ripped from Jericho's throat, blowing the rain backward in a visible shockwave. Without another word, the Iron Alpha lunged forward, a blur of unstoppable muscle and pure vengeance. He hit the front line of cabal executioners like a meteor, his massive claws shearing straight through their tactical body armor and snapping their spines with a single fluid sweep of his arm. They tried to fire their automatic weapons, but the bullets simply flattened against his newly thickened, magically enhanced hide. More importantly, his focus was entirely locked onto Logan, who was frantically trying to climb into the driver's seat of the lead SUV. What followed was a display of absolute unmitigated dominance that showcased why Jericho Vance had ruled the Northern Territories for a decade. He grabbed the rear bumper of the multi-ton armored vehicle, his claws ripping into the steel, and with a terrifying heave of his shoulders, he flipped the entire truck upside down onto the asphalt. Logan crawled out of the shattered driver's side window, his face covered in blood and fuel, his eyes wide with a frantic, paralyzing terror as Jericho's massive shadow completely swallowed him whole. "Wait! Vance, please!" Logan choked out, raising his trembling hands in a useless gesture of submission. Instead of showing mercy, Jericho pinned Logan to the pavement with a single massive paw, his jaws opening wide to reveal rows of razor-sharp ivory teeth glistening with dark saliva. With a single savage snap, he tore the rival Alpha's throat completely out, ending the Obsidian Cabal's reign of terror in a single bloody second. He stood alone in the center of the ruined street, surrounded by the smoking wreckage of his enemies, his massive chest heaving as the primal adrenaline slowly began to recede from his mind. Chapter 21. The Witch's Awakening. The silence that followed the slaughter was heavier than the storm itself. Jericho shifted back into his human form, his body covered in a mixture of dark rain and enemy blood as he stumbled back toward the gutter where Clara lay. He dropped to his knees, his massive hands trembling violently as he scooped her cold, fragile frame into his lap, pulling her tightly against his chest. "Please," he whispered against her hair, his tears mingling with the rain on her pale skin. "Don't leave me in the dark. Come back." Suddenly, as his blood-soaked fingers brushed against her chest, the space between them burned with a blinding, iridescent white light. What's worse, the concentrated silver wolfsbane poison that Logan had forced her to drink hadn't destroyed her human organs. In fact, it had acted as a violent, chemical catalyst that completely shattered the dormant genetic blocks holding her heritage back. Her pure Etheria witch bloodline had fully awakened in response to the lethal threat, turning her body into a living, breathing reservoir of pure spiritual magic. Before he could even move, Clara's chest heaved with a sharp, gasping breath, her eyes snapping open to reveal iris rings of a brilliant, luminescent silver. A wave of pure, concentrated healing energy erupted from her core, washing over the entire street like a warm summer breeze, instantly repairing the ruined brickwork of the café and dissolving the toxic silver poison in Jericho's veins. She looked up at his face, her small hands reaching up to cradle his jaw with that same beautiful, unyielding defiance. "I told you, Jericho," she whispered, her voice carrying a soft, multi-tonal echo of ancient power. "We aren't running. We are rebuilding." Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The question was finally answered as his soul answered hers, their lips meeting in a fierce, passionate kiss that sealed their eternal bond beneath the clearing sky. He was no longer a disposable weapon, and she was no longer a helpless refugee. Together, they were the architects of a brand new, unstoppable empire built on the foundation of their beautiful, unbroken sanctuary, the Sovereign Covenant. The morning sun broke through the clearing storm clouds, casting long golden beams across the wet pavement. Jericho stood proudly in the center of the completely restored dining room of the Daily Grind, his massive arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. The scent of fresh lumber, rich coffee beans, and that signature, sweet lavender, filled the crisp air, entirely erasing the foul odor of the midnight battle. Surviving lichen warriors from his old pack stood in neat rows along the walls, their heads bowed low in absolute, unyielding reverence to their reborn commander. Low, rumbling tone. "Rise," Jericho commanded, his voice a smooth, deep rumble that carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. What followed was a moment of profound, breathless silence as his loyal subcommanders stood up, their eyes fixed on the remarkable sight before them. They didn't see a broken, fatalistic war weapon anymore. Instead, they saw a true, restored sovereign who had finally found his grounding purpose. Next, Clara stepped out from the back kitchen, wearing a brand new denim apron that neatly covered her newly awakened, silver-glowing etherea aura. Because of that, the hardened soldiers instantly dropped to one knee a second time, recognizing her not just as a human barista, but as the supreme matriarch of their new alliance. She didn't shrink back from their intense supernatural pressure, choosing instead to nod her head in gruff, no-nonsense approval as she set down a fresh tray of hot pastries. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? Deep down, the answer was written in the very air of the shop. He had found his peace, not by running away from his violent strength, but by using it to build a fortress for her light. Yet, he knew their work was barely beginning. The old pack structures were completely broken, and a new order had to be carved out of the ashes of the obsidian cabal. Without another word, Jericho stepped forward, his massive hand wrapping securely around Clara's waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. Chapter 23. The Rebuilding of Borders. The hiss of the espresso machine sounded exactly like a triumphant battle cry in the quiet morning. Come morning, the human district was returning to life, completely oblivious to the massive geopolitical shift that had occurred on their block. Jericho sat at the corner booth working side by side with Clara as they drafted the new laws of their territory on a simple paper napkin. They were creating a unique, unprecedented sanctuary where humans and supernatural refugees could live together under the direct protection of the Iron Alpha and the Etherea Witch. More importantly, the predatory commercial landlords who had threatened her business were currently signing over the property deeds for a fraction of the cost, entirely terrified of Jericho's silent, corporate enforcer persona. Despite that, Clara refused to let the sudden influx of supernatural wealth change the simple, ordinary nature of her beloved shop. "I don't care if we own the entire city sector now, Jericho," she said, her voice a sharp, playful snap as she handed him a fresh dish towel. "You still haven't finished wiping down the back prep tables, and the afternoon rush is coming." What's worse, a small group of rogue wolves from Logan's broken pack tried to cross the northern border fence an hour later, testing the limits of his new regime. Before they could even take 3 steps into the district, the defensive Etherea runes carved into the lampposts flared with a brilliant, blinding silver light. The rogue wolves instantly dropped to the ground, their dark powers completely neutralized by the passive spiritual wards before Jericho even needed to flex a single muscle. She didn't know what scared her more, the reality of her massive new magical responsibility, or the fact that she was deeply, hopelessly in love with the king of monsters. Truth to be told, they were no longer two isolated souls hoarding their own survival strategies in the dark. But then the space between them burned with a sudden, heavy spike of pure, unadulterated desire as Jericho caught her wrist mid-sweep. Chapter 24. The Coffee and the Crown. The moment their eyes locked in the quiet kitchen, the entire outside world simply ceased to exist. Jericho pulled her gently into his lap, his massive, scarred hands cupping her face with a level of passion that made her breath catch completely in her throat. He leaned down, his lips brushing softly against hers, tasting the sweet vanilla and crisp lavender that had originally saved his dying soul from the gutter. "You gave me a crown, Clara," Jericho whispered against her mouth, his golden eyes glowing with an intense, possessive heat. "But this shop is the only kingdom I ever want to rule." As the silence stretched between them, her body moved on instinct, her arms wrapping tightly around his thick neck as she deepened the kiss. The ancient frost around his heart was completely gone, replaced by a roaring, eternal flame that bound their destinies together for the rest of their immortal lives. With every heartbeat, the bond pulsed with a brilliant, unyielding clarity, proving that even the most damaged monsters can find their ultimate salvation in the hands of a fierce, unconditional love. Can a man who became a monster to survive ever deserve a sanctuary of peace? Or is he doomed to destroy the only hands gentle enough to hold him? The final answer hung beautifully in the air as the brass bell above the front door rang merrily, signaling the very first customer of their brand new world. Jericho stood up, smoothing down his apron with a quiet smile, fully ready to protect his domestic sanctuary until the absolute end of time. The end.